If someone had told me that letting my son move back home would end with me sleeping on a pull-out couch while his Great Dane claimed my master bedroom, I would have changed the locks and thrown away the key. But there I was at 3 a.m., listening to Rex snoring in what used to be my sanctuary, while my own family treated me like an unwelcome guest in the house I'd been paying for since 1987. The moment I realized they'd installed a doggy door in my bedroom wall without asking, I knew this wasn't about helping family anymore. This was about taking everything I'd worked for and calling it love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Flossie Reed, and I'm 71 years old. Last Tuesday morning, I woke up on a fold-out couch in what used to be my own living room because my son decided his dog needed my bedroom more than I did. What happened next? Well, let's just say some lessons in respect have to be taught the hard way. I should have seen it coming when Marcus first asked to move back in. He was 45, recently divorced, and claimed he just needed a few months to get back on his feet. That was 8 months ago. What started as a temporary arrangement had slowly morphed into something I didn't recognize. My quiet mornings became his loud phone calls. My evening news became his video games. My peaceful dinners became his complaints about everything from the water pressure to the brand of coffee I bought. But the real shift happened when he brought Rex home 3 weeks ago. 160 pounds of slobbering, tail-wagging chaos that Marcus introduced as his emotional support animal. I'd always been a cat person, partial to quiet creatures that minded their own business. Rex was the opposite of quiet. He barked at every car, every neighbor, every shadow that dared cross our property line. More importantly, he was massive, and my little 2-bedroom ranch suddenly felt like a dollhouse trying to contain a small horse. The first night, Marcus set up Rex's bed in the living room. Fine, I thought, we could make it work. Animals need space too. But by the third night, Rex had somehow migrated to my bedroom. Marcus claimed the dog had separation anxiety and needed to sleep near someone. Since Marcus was staying in the guest bedroom, which he'd claimed was too small for both him and the dog, Rex naturally gravitated toward the master bedroom where I slept. I woke up that first morning with Rex's massive head on my pillow, his breath warming my face like a furnace. When I mentioned it to Marcus over breakfast, he just shrugged and said Rex was still adjusting. "Give it time," he said. "The dog will settle down once he feels secure." But Rex didn't settle down. He claimed more territory each day. First it was my bed, then my reading chair by the window, then the entire bedroom. Marcus installed a dog bed the size of a twin mattress right in the middle of my room, directly in front of my dresser. When I objected, Marcus looked at me like I was being selfish. "Mom, he's not hurting anything," Marcus said, barely looking up from his phone. "Besides, you're up most of the night anyway with your insomnia. At least Rex sleeps through the night." That comment stung more than it should have. Yes, I'd been having trouble sleeping since his father died 2 years ago. Yes, I wandered the house at night sometimes, missing the quiet conversations we used to have over late-night tea. But my insomnia didn't mean I'd forfeited my right to my own bedroom. It didn't mean I should be grateful for whatever space was left over after the dog got comfortable. The breaking point came last Monday night. I'd had a particularly difficult day dealing with insurance paperwork for my late husband's medical bills, and all I wanted was to retreat to my room, run a hot bath, and read a few chapters of the mystery novel I'd been saving. Instead, I found Rex sprawled across my entire bed, Marcus's gaming headset on my nightstand, and a half-eaten sandwich on my dresser. "Marcus," I called out, standing in the doorway, "can you please move Rex? I'd like to go to bed." Marcus appeared in the hallway, controller still in his hand. "He's finally sleeping, Mom. Can't you just use the couch tonight? I'll move him tomorrow." I stared at my son, this man I'd raised, who was asking me to sleep on the couch in my own house so his dog could have my bed. "This is my bedroom. Marcus, I've slept in this bed for 34 years, and you'll sleep in it tomorrow," he said, already turning back toward the guest room. "One night on the couch won't kill you." but it wasn't one night. When I woke up Tuesday morning on that fold-out couch, my back screaming and my neck stiff as a board, I found Rex still in my bed, and Marcus already gone for the day. There was a note on the kitchen counter written in his sloppy handwriting. Took Rex to the vet for his shots. Back tonight. There's sandwich meat in the fridge if you get hungry. No apology. No acknowledgement that he'd essentially evicted me from my own room. Just instructions about lunch meat, like I was a house guest. He barely tolerated. I spent that day moving like a stranger through my own home. Every room felt different, claimed by someone else's presence. The guest bathroom had Marcus's shaving cream and cologne cluttering the counter. The kitchen had Rex's food and water bowls taking up half the floor space. The living room had been rearranged to accommodate the dog's bed. My reading chair pushed into a corner to make room for Marcus's gaming setup. When had I become the visitor in my own house? That evening, when Marcus returned with Rex, I was waiting in the kitchen with my hands folded on the table. I'd spent the afternoon thinking, and I was ready for a calm, mature conversation about boundaries and respect. We need to talk about the sleeping arrangements. I began. Marcus set Rex's leash on the counter and opened the refrigerator. Without looking at me. What about them? I slept on the couch last night, because you said Rex needed the bed. I'm 71 years old. Marcus, I can't keep sleeping on a fold-out couch. He pulled out a beer and popped it open. So what do you want me to do? Rex gets anxious when he's alone. He's been through a lot with the divorce and everything. He's a dog, Marcus. He's family. Marcus snapped. And he needs stability right now. We all do. I watched my son drink his beer and stare out the window like I was bothering him with trivial complaints. This was the same boy I'd driven to soccer practice every Saturday for 6 years. The same boy I'd helped with homework and heartbreaks and job interviews. Now he was treating me like an inconvenience, because I wanted to sleep in my own bed. Fine, I said quietly. If Rex needs the master bedroom, maybe we should think about other arrangements. Marcus turned around, eyebrows raised. What kind of arrangements? Maybe it's time for you to find your own place. You said you just needed a few months to get back on your feet. It's been 8 months. His expression shifted from surprise to something harder. Are you kicking me out? I'm asking you to respect my space. If you can't do that, then maybe this arrangement isn't working. Marcus set his beer down hard on the counter. Unbelievable. I'm going through the worst time of my life, and you want to throw me out because of where a dog sleeps. This isn't about the dog, I said, though we both knew it was. This is about feeling like a guest in my own home. Well, maybe that's because you're acting like one, Marcus said. Ever since Dad died, you've been walking around here like you're afraid to take up space. Rex isn't the problem. You are. The words hit me like a slap. I sat there staring at him. This man who looked like my son but sounded like a stranger. Someone who could look at my grief and call it weakness. Someone who could take my kindness and twist it into something shameful. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out of my house, tonight, Marcus laughed. But it wasn't a happy sound. You're being dramatic. We'll figure something out tomorrow when you're thinking clearly. I am thinking clearly, I said, standing up. Clearer than I have in months. I want you and Rex out of my house by tomorrow evening, and if I don't, I looked at him for a long moment. This man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. Then I'll make you go. Marcus shook his head and picked up his beer. Good luck with that, Mom. This is my home too. I have rights. After he left the kitchen, I sat alone at the table, as the sun set outside my window. Rights, he'd said. What rights did he think he had to my bedroom? My peace, my space. I'd given him 8 months of free rent, free food, and unlimited patience. In return, he'd given me a fold-out couch and a lecture about taking up space. That night, I slept on the couch again, but this time it felt different. Not like defeat, but like the last night of something that was ending. I lay there listening to Rex snore in my bedroom, and Marcus's video games in the guest room. And I made a decision. If Marcus thought he had rights to my house, it was time he learned exactly whose name was on the deed. And if he wanted to treat me like a stranger in my own home, then maybe it was time I started acting like one, a stranger, with a very good lawyer. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. My back ached from another night on the fold-out couch, but my mind was sharp and focused. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And sat at the table with a notepad, writing down everything I could remember about the past 8 months. Not just the big moments, but the small ones too. The way Marcus had gradually taken over the remote control, the way he'd rearranged my furniture without asking, the way he'd started making decisions about my house, like it was his. By the time Marcus stumbled into the kitchen at 10 o'clock, I was dressed and ready for the day. He looked surprised to see me up and alert, like he'd expected to find me wallowing in last night's argument. "Morning, Mom," he said cautiously, pouring himself coffee. "Look, maybe we got a little heated last night. Why don't we talk about this reasonably?" "I am being reasonable," I said, closing my notepad. "You have until 6 o'clock tonight to pack your things and leave." Marcus set his mug down and stared at me. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not my problem to solve anymore." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was trying to think his way out of trouble. "Mom, come on, we're family. We don't throw each other away over stupid arguments." "We're not throwing each other away, we're establishing boundaries. Something I should have done months ago." "Boundaries?" Marcus laughed. "Is that what your grief counselor told you to say?" I felt my temper flare, but I kept my voice level. "Don't bring my counseling into this." "Why not? It's obviously affecting your judgment." "Dad's been gone for 2 years. Mom, you can't keep using his death as an excuse to push everyone away." The words were calculated to hurt, and they found their target. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the one that reminded me I was facing this alone. But underneath the hurt was something else. Anger. Clean, sharp anger at being manipulated by someone who was supposed to love me. "Your father's death isn't an excuse for anything," I said quietly, "but it did teach me something important. Life is short, and I'm not going to spend what's left of mine being disrespected in my own home." Marcus's expression shifted. He wasn't used to me fighting back. For 8 months, I'd absorbed his complaints, accommodated his needs, and swallowed my own frustration in the name of family harmony. Now, suddenly, I wasn't bending anymore. "What if I compromise?" he said, switching tactics. "What if Rex sleeps in the guest room with me? What if you find your own place?" "Mom, be reasonable. I'm still getting back on my feet financially. I need more time." "You've had 8 months, and in those 8 months, you've taken over my house, disrespected my space, and last night you had the audacity to tell me I was the problem." That doesn't sound like someone who needs more time. That sounds like someone who's gotten too comfortable. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Fine, you want to be alone in this big house. You want to rattle around here by yourself, talking to Dad's ghost. Be my guest, but don't come crying to me when you realize you made a mistake." He stormed out of the kitchen, Rex trailing behind him. I heard doors slamming, heavy footsteps, the sound of someone packing in anger. Good, I thought. Let him be angry. Anger was honest. It was better than the fake concern and manipulation he'd been using to justify taking advantage of me. By noon, the house was quiet. Marcus had loaded his truck with his belongings, and Rex's supplies, making sure I saw every box and bag. As he carried them out, he was trying to make me feel guilty, to make me doubt my decision, but all I felt was relief. As his truck pulled out of the driveway, I walked through my house slowly, room by room. The guest bedroom looked empty but not sad. The living room, with my reading chair back in its rightful place, felt like mine again. And my bedroom, with Rex's massive dog bed finally gone, felt like a sanctuary again. I sat on my own bed for the first time in 3 days, and called my sister Helen in Portland. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice warm and familiar. "Better than I expected," I said. "I think I just fired my son." Helen laughed. "About time. I was wondering when you'd stop letting that boy walk all over you." "Was it that obvious?" "Honey, you've been tiptoeing around your own house for months. Every time we talked, you sounded like you were whispering so you wouldn't disturb anyone." She was right. I had been whispering in my own life, making myself smaller, so Marcus could feel bigger, but I wasn't whispering anymore. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I took a long hot bath in my own bathroom, without worrying about using up all the hot water. I read 3 chapters of my mystery novel in my reading chair by the window. I made myself a proper dinner, and ate it at the kitchen table while watching the evening news at a reasonable volume. For the first time in 8 months, my house felt like home again, but my peace was short-lived. The next morning, I woke up to find Marcus's truck in my driveway again. He was sitting on my front porch with Rex at his feet, looking disheveled and tired. "I don't have anywhere else to go," he said, when I opened the door. "Jenny's won't let me stay there with Rex, and every apartment complex in town has a no pets policy, or wants a deposit I can't afford." I stood in the doorway in my robe, feeling the morning chill on my face. "That's unfortunate, but it's still not my problem. I'm your son. You're a 45-year-old man who told me I was the problem in my own house. Being my son doesn't give you the right to treat me like a doormat." Marcus stood up, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. "Please, Mom, just give me one more chance. I'll keep Rex out of your room. I'll help with expenses. We can set up rules, boundaries, whatever you want. The boundary I want is you living somewhere else. I can't afford somewhere else right now." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided I was the problem." We stared at each other across the threshold of my house. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out which angle might work, the guilt angle, the family angle, the desperation angle. But I wasn't buying any of it anymore. "What if I pay rent?" he said finally. "Real rent, like a real tenant." "I don't want a tenant, I want my house back. Mom, please, I'm begging you." There was something in his voice, something broken and real, that almost made me waver, almost. But then I remembered the sound of Rex snoring in my bedroom, while I lay on the couch with my back seizing up. I remembered Marcus telling me I was the problem. I remembered feeling like a stranger in my own home. "The answer is no, Marcus. I'm sorry you're in a difficult situation, but you're going to have to figure it out without using my house as a safety net." I started to close the door, but Marcus put his hand against it. "You can't just abandon me." "I'm not abandoning you. I'm setting a boundary. There's a difference." What would Dad say about this? The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. Marcus knew exactly what he was doing, using my grief as a weapon. But this time, instead of crumbling, I felt something harden inside me. "Your father would say that respect works both ways," I said quietly, "and he'd be ashamed of the way you've been treating me." Marcus stepped back like I'd slapped him. Maybe I had, in a way. "Sometimes the truth hits like a slap. I'll give you 10 minutes to get your things off my porch," I said. "After that, I'm calling the police for trespassing." "You wouldn't try me." I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking slightly. Through the window I watched Marcus load Rex back into his truck. He sat there for a long time, staring at the house, probably hoping I'd change my mind, but I did. I made myself a cup of tea, and waited until I heard his truck start and pull away. The silence that followed felt different from the day before, not peaceful, exactly, but determined. I'd drawn a line, and held it, even when it hurt, even when it meant watching my son drive away, without knowing where he'd spend the night. But as I sat in my kitchen sipping tea, I realized something important. Setting boundaries wasn't cruel, it was necessary. And sometimes, the people who love us need to learn that we won't accept being treated poorly, even by them, especially by them. The rest of that day passed quietly. I called Helen to tell her about the morning's confrontation, and she listened without judgment. "You did the right thing," she said. "It's going to hurt for a while, but you did the right thing." "How do you know?" "Because for the first time in months, you sound like yourself again." That evening, I sat in my reading chair and watched the sunset through my living room window. My house felt empty, but it also felt like mine. There was a difference, I was learning, between being alone and being lonely. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was home, but Marcus wasn't done trying to reclaim his place in my house. Over the next few days, the calls started. First, they were apologetic, then pleading, then angry, then desperate. Each call followed the same pattern. He was sorry, he'd learned his lesson, he just needed one more chance. I stopped answering after the third call. Then came the texts, long rambling messages about family loyalty and second chances, and how much he needed me. Most people don't see that side of Marcus. He's very good at presenting himself as the victim. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Jenny stared out the window, probably reconsidering her mission of mercy. "You know," she said finally, "when we were married, Marcus had a way of making me feel like I was overreacting whenever I stood up for myself. He'd apologize afterward, but somehow I always ended up being the one who compromised." That sounds familiar. I used to think it was just his way of avoiding conflict. Now I think it was his way of winning every argument without actually addressing the problem. Jenny stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I should go. I'm sorry for bothering you with this." "You weren't bothering me. I appreciate that you care about both of us. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Marcus needs to learn that other people's kindness isn't weakness." After Jenny left, I sat in my quiet living room and thought about what she'd said. Marcus had a pattern of making people feel like they were overreacting when they stood up for themselves. He'd done it to Jenny during their marriage, and he'd been doing it to me for months. The only difference was that I'd finally stopped falling for it. That night, I slept peacefully in my own bed for the first time in weeks. No snoring dog, no gaming sounds from the next room, no walking on eggshells in my own house. Just quiet, blessed quiet. But Marcus still wasn't done. The next morning, I found him sitting on my front porch again, but this time he wasn't alone. My sister Helen was with him, and she looked uncomfortable. "Helen," I said, opening the door. "What are you doing here?" "Marcus called me," he asked me to drive down from Portland to help you two work things out." I looked at my sister, who'd driven 4 hours at the request of my son, and felt a familiar surge of anger. Marcus was using everyone in my life as ammunition in his campaign to get back into my house. "That was thoughtful of you to come," I said, "but unnecessary." "Mom," Marcus said, standing up, "I know you're mad at me, but families shouldn't give up on each other." Aunt Helen agrees. I looked at my sister, who was shifting uncomfortably on my porch. "Is that what you think, Helen?" "I think family is complicated," she said diplomatically. "And I think you two need to talk." "We've talked. The conversation is over." "Flossie," Helen said gently, "maybe you could hear him out. He seems genuinely sorry." I felt trapped between my love for my sister and my frustration with being manipulated. Helen had driven 4 hours to help, and she didn't understand the full context of what had been happening. To her, this probably looked like a simple family argument that could be resolved with a heart-to-heart conversation. "Fine," I said. "We can talk. But we're doing it inside, and we're doing it once. After that, Helen, I hope you'll respect my decision. Whatever it is." We sat in my living room, Helen on the couch, Marcus in the chair across from me. He looked tired and worn down, like he'd been sleeping poorly. Good, I thought. Maybe discomfort would teach him something. "I'm sorry," Marcus began. "I'm sorry for taking over your house, for treating you like you didn't matter, for everything. I was going through a rough time, and I took it out on you. That was wrong." I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to think that was enough. "What specifically are you sorry for?" I asked. Marcus looked confused. "Everything. I just said that." "Be specific. What exactly did you do wrong?" He glanced at Helen, who nodded encouragingly. "I let Rex sleep in your room." "What else?" "I didn't help with expenses like I should have." "What else?" Marcus was getting frustrated. I could see it in his face. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to acknowledge what you actually did, not just vague apologies, but specific recognition of how you treated me." "Fine. I treated you badly. I'm sorry." Helen shifted uncomfortably on the couch. She could sense that this wasn't going the way she'd hoped. "Marcus," I said quietly, "when I asked you to move Rex out of my bedroom, what did you say?" "I don't remember exactly. You said Rex was family and needed stability. You suggested that my insomnia meant I didn't really need the bedroom anyway." I was trying to find a solution that worked for everyone. No, you were dismissing my needs in favor of a dog's comfort. When I objected to sleeping on the couch, what did you say? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I said you were being dramatic. What else? I don't remember. You said I was acting like a guest in my own home because I was afraid to take up space. You said my grief was the problem, not your behavior. Helen's eyes wide. She was finally starting to understand why I'd been so firm in my boundaries. I was upset, Marcus said. People say things they don't mean when they're upset. Do they? When I'm upset, I don't attack people's grief or try to make them feel small. When I'm upset, I don't take over other people's bedrooms and then act like they're being unreasonable when they object. Marcus looked at Helen desperately. Aunt Helen, you see what I mean. She's not giving me any room to make this right. What would making it right look like? I asked. Me moving back in, us being a family again. Why would you moving back into my house make things right? Because that's what families do. They stick together. I looked at my son. This man who still thought that family meant having unlimited access to other people's resources and patience, who thought that love meant never having to face consequences for your actions. Marcus, I said, families do stick together, but they also respect each other. They don't take advantage of each other's kindness. They don't attack each other's grief when they don't get their way. And they don't think that being related gives them the right to treat each other poorly. I never treated you poorly. You took over my bedroom without asking. You dismissed my needs when I objected. You rearranged my furniture and changed my routines without consulting me. You made me feel like a stranger in my own home. How is that not treating me poorly? Marcus was quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been genuine remorse. I didn't think of it that way, he said quietly. I thought I was just trying to make the best of a difficult situation. By making me invisible in my own life, I didn't mean to make you invisible, but you did. And when I tried to become visible again, you told me I was the problem. Helen had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. Marcus, your mother has a point. You can't treat someone's home like it's your personal space, and then act surprised when they object. Marcus looked between us, probably realizing that his reinforcement wasn't coming. So what do you want? He asked me. What would it take for you to forgive me? I do forgive you, I said. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean giving you another chance to do it again. So that's it? You're just done with me. I'm done with being treated like a convenience in my own life. If you can figure out how to have a relationship with me that doesn't involve taking advantage of my kindness, I'm open to that. But it's not going to happen with you living in my house. Marcus stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. You're throwing away our relationship over a bedroom and a dog. No, Marcus, you threw away our relationship when you decided your comfort was more important than my dignity. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Helen and I sat in the sudden quiet, listening to his truck start and drive away. I'm sorry, Helen said finally. I thought I was helping. You were trying to help. But Marcus has been manipulating this situation from the beginning. He's very good at making other people feel like they're being unreasonable when they stand up to him. Helen nodded slowly. I can see that now. When he called me, he made it sound like you were being stubborn over a minor disagreement. That's his pattern. Make the other person's boundaries sound unreasonable, then recruit allies to pressure them into backing down. Well, he won't be recruiting me again. I'm sorry I got pulled into this. Helen stayed for dinner, and we had a good conversation about boundaries and family dynamics. She told me about her own struggles with her adult children, and how hard it had been to learn that love didn't mean accepting poor treatment. You know, she said as she was getting ready to leave, you seem stronger than you have in a long time. I feel strong. It's amazing what happens when you stop apologizing for taking up space in your own life. After Helen left, I sat in my quiet house and reflected on the day. Marcus had finally shown his true colors in front of a witness, which felt validating in a way I hadn't expected. For months I'd been second-guessing myself, wondering if I was being too sensitive or unreasonable. Now I knew I wasn't, but I also knew this wasn't over. Marcus was persistent, and he still believed he could find the right combination of pressure and manipulation to get what he wanted. He'd proven that by involving Helen, and I suspected there would be other attempts. I was right. Over the next week, Marcus tried several more approaches. He had his friend Dave call me to vouch for his character. He sent flowers with a note about how much he missed. He even had my grandchildren, his kids with Jenny, called to ask when they could visit Grandma again. That last one was the hardest to handle. Sarah and Jake were 12 and 14, and they didn't understand why their father couldn't live with me anymore. They just knew they couldn't come over as often because their dad was staying in a motel. "Grandma," Sarah said during one of these calls, "Daddy says you're mad at him. Can't you just forgive him?" My heart ached for these kids who were caught in the middle of adult problems they couldn't understand. "I'm not mad at your daddy, sweetheart," I said. "Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about how they want to live. Your daddy and I are figuring out how to have a good relationship while living in different places. But why can't he just live with you? The house is big enough." How do you explain to a child that their father spent 8 months treating their grandmother like an inconvenience? How do you tell them that forgiveness doesn't always mean pretending nothing happened? "Sometimes people need their own space to be happy," I said. "That doesn't mean we don't love each other." After I hung up from talking to Sarah, I sat in my kitchen feeling the weight of the situation in a new way. It was one thing to set boundaries with Marcus, but seeing how it affected my grandchildren made everything more complicated. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this mess, but I also couldn't let guilt about their confusion drive me back into accepting unacceptable treatment. I called Jenny that evening to talk about the kids and how to handle their questions. "I don't want them to think this is their fault," I told her, "but I also don't want to badmouth Marcus to them." "You're handling it perfectly," Jenny said. "I've been trying to explain it in age-appropriate ways. Sarah understands better than Jake, but they're both struggling with the change." "What has Marcus told them?" Jenny was quiet for a moment. "He's told them that you're going through a hard time since their grandfather died, and that you need space to figure things out." I felt a familiar flash of anger. Even now, Marcus was using my grief as an explanation for his own consequences, making it sound like this was about my emotional state rather than his behavior. "That's not accurate," I said carefully. "I know, but it's easier for them to understand than the real situation. They don't need to know that their father was treating you poorly." Jenny was right, of course. The children didn't need the details of their father's selfishness, but it frustrated me that Marcus got to maintain his image as the caring son dealing with his difficult, grieving mother. "Jenny, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "During your marriage, did Marcus ever make you feel like you were being unreasonable when you stood up for yourself?" Jenny sighed deeply. "All the time. He had this way of making every conflict about my emotional state rather than his behavior. If I complained about something he did, suddenly the problem was that I was being too sensitive or hormonal, or stressed from work." "How did you deal with it?" "I stopped complaining, which in retrospect was exactly what he wanted. He trained me to accept whatever he dished out by making the alternative feel worse than the original problem." This conversation with Jenny crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. Marcus hadn't just been inconsiderate about the bedroom situation. He'd been systematically training me to accept less and less respect in my own home, using my love for him and my natural desire to avoid conflict as weapons against my own well-being. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called a locksmith. "I need all the locks changed on my house," I told the woman who answered the phone. "Any particular reason?" "Break-in, lost keys. I need to control who has access to my property." The locksmith, a competent woman named Rita who looked to be about my age, arrived that afternoon with new deadbolts and door handles. As she worked, we chatted about home security and independence. "You'd be surprised how many women my age call for this service," Rita said as she installed the new front door lock, usually after they've had to set boundaries with adult children or relatives who think they can come and go as they please. "Really?" "Oh yeah, there's something about being a widow that makes certain people think you've lost the right to privacy and autonomy in your own home, like grief makes you incompetent to make decisions about your own life." Rita's words resonated deeply. That was exactly what Marcus had been doing, treating my grief as a sign that I needed him to take charge of my living situation. He'd positioned himself as the caretaker while systematically taking over my space and dismissing my objections. When Rita finished with the locks, she handed me a set of new keys. "These are yours," she said. "Nobody else gets copies unless you decide to give them out." I held the keys in my palm, feeling their weight. Such small things, but they represented something enormous. My right to control who entered my space. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. I'd worked with Tom Brennan for years, first when my husband was setting up his will, then again when we dealt with insurance claims after his death. Tom was thorough, practical, and he didn't talk down to me the way some professionals did with older women. "Flossie," Tom said when his secretary put me through, "good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" "Better than expected, actually." "Tom, I need some advice about property rights and tenant law." "What's going on?" I explained the situation with Marcus, trying to stick to the facts rather than the emotions. Tom listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and arrangements. "So he's been living there rent-free for 8 months, and when you asked him to leave, he refused?" "Initially, yes. He's since moved out, but he's making it clear that he considers this temporary. He keeps trying to manipulate his way back in." "Has he established residence, been receiving mail there, using it as his address for official purposes?" "Yes, he changed his address with the post office, and used my address for his unemployment benefits." Tom was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him typing on his computer. "Flossie, this could be more complicated than a simple houseguest situation. If Marcus has established residency, you might need to go through formal eviction proceedings to legally prevent him from returning." My heart sank. Even though my name is the only one on the property, ownership and tenant rights are two different things. The fact that you're related makes it even more complex. Some courts are reluctant to enforce eviction orders between family members without clear evidence of lease violations or threatening behavior. "What about changing the locks?" "That's legally problematic if he's considered a tenant. You could be accused of illegal lockout." I felt the walls closing in around me. Just when I thought I'd taken control of the situation, I was learning that the law might not be on my side. What are my options? Well, the fact that he's voluntarily moved out helps. If you can document a pattern of him agreeing to alternative living arrangements, it strengthens the case that he's not actually a tenant with rights to the property. "Do you have any of these conversations in writing?" "Some text messages, but most of it was verbal." "Start documenting everything going forward. If he contacts you about moving back in, try to get those conversations in writing, email, text, whatever you can manage. And if he just shows up and tries to move back in, call the police. Let them determine whether it's a family dispute or a trespassing issue. The more documentation you have of him agreeing to live elsewhere, the better." After I hung up with Tom, I felt deflated. I'd thought that owning my house meant I could control who lived in it, but apparently the law was more complicated than that. Marcus might have rights to my property simply because he'd been staying there long enough to call it home, but I wasn't going to let legal complexity scare me into backing down. If anything, it reinforced how important it was to maintain clear boundaries. I couldn't afford to let Marcus think he could manipulate his way back into my house, especially if doing so might give him legal standing to stay. That evening, as if he could sense my renewed determination, Marcus called. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I think maybe I was too emotional to really hear what you were saying." "What do you think I was saying?" "That you need more respect and consideration." "I get that. I was going through my own stuff and I wasn't paying attention to how my choices were affecting you." This was a more sophisticated approach than his previous attempt. Instead of dismissing my concerns or recruiting allies, he was acknowledging them, while positioning himself as someone who'd learned from the experience. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "So I was thinking, what if we tried a different arrangement? What if I found my own place but we could still see each other regularly? Maybe I could come over for dinner sometimes, or help you with yard work or errands." It sounded reasonable, the kind of relationship I might actually want with my adult son. But I'd learned to be suspicious of Marcus's reasonable-sounding proposals. "That could work," I said. "Have you found a place?" "Well, that's the thing.
I'm still looking, but the rental market is tough right now, especially with most places either don't allow pets or want deposits I can't afford. That's challenging, so I was wondering if maybe just temporarily, I could move back in while I keep looking, but this time we'd have clear rules about space and responsibilities. There it was.
But if you're concerned about Marcus challenging your wishes, there are some additional protections we can put in place. What kind of protections? We could establish a living trust that specifies exactly how your property should be handled. We could also add language that explicitly disinherits anyone who contests the will or attempts to manipulate you regarding your property. Would that prevent Marcus from claiming he has rights to the house? It would make it much more difficult, especially if we document your current mental competency and your clear intention to maintain control over your property. We spent the next hour revising my estate documents and creating new protections. It felt strange to be taking legal action to protect myself from my own son, but it also felt necessary. "Tom," I said as we finished up, "do you think I'm being too harsh? Other people seem to think I should give Marcus another chance." Tom leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. "Flossie, I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've seen a lot of family disputes over property and money. In my experience, the people who think you're being too harsh are usually the people who've never had to set boundaries with someone who refuses to respect them. But he's my son, and you're his mother. That relationship goes both ways. He owes you respect and consideration just as much as you owe him love and support." Tom's words stayed with me as I drove home. I'd been so focused on what I owed Marcus as his mother that I'd forgotten what he owed me as my son. That evening, I called Helen to tell her about the estate planning meeting. "Are you sure that's necessary?" she asked. "It seems like you're preparing for war. I'm preparing to protect myself." "There's a difference. But Marcus is family. Surely he wouldn't try to take your house." "Helen, a month ago I would have said Marcus would never treat me like a stranger in my own home. I've learned not to assume what he will and won't do." Helen was quiet for a moment. "I suppose you're right. I just hate to see families torn apart over property." This family wasn't torn apart over property. It was torn apart when Marcus decided his comfort was more important than my dignity. After we hung up, I realized that Helen, like many people, was focusing on the wrong thing. She saw this as a property dispute, but it was really about respect and boundaries. The house was just the battleground where a much deeper conflict was playing out. 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a woman's voice asked for Flossie Reed. "This is Mrs. Reed. This is Sandra Williams from Pacific Property Management. I understand you have a son who's looking for pet-friendly rental housing." I felt my stomach drop. "I'm sorry." "What? Marcus Reed? He listed you as a reference for a rental application. He said you could vouch for his character and his ability to care for a large dog." Marcus was using me as a reference without asking, probably hoping I'd feel obligated to help him once I was put on the spot. "I wasn't aware that Marcus had listed me as a reference," I said carefully. "Oh, well, he said you were very close and that you'd been helping him through a difficult transition. He mentioned that you'd been housing him and his dog while he looked for a permanent place." Marcus had crafted his story carefully, making it sound like I was supportive of his housing search and that our arrangement had been cooperative and ongoing. "What specifically did he tell you about our arrangement?" "He said he'd been staying with you since his divorce, helping with household tasks and keeping you company. He painted a picture of a very devoted son, caring for his widowed mother." I felt angry and impressed at the same time. Marcus had turned 8 months of taking advantage of me into a narrative of mutual care and support. "Ms. Williams, I need to be honest with you. Marcus did stay with me for several months, but our arrangement ended when he began treating my home as his own rather than respecting it as my space. I asked him to leave, and while I wish him well in finding housing, I can't provide a positive reference for him as a tenant." There was a long pause. "I see, that's not what he indicated." "I'm sure it's not. Marcus has a way of presenting situations in the light most favorable to him." "Well, thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Reed. This definitely changes our evaluation of his application." After I hung up, I felt both vindicated and sad. Vindicated because Marcus's attempt to use me without permission had backfired. Sad because it was yet another example of him treating me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. But I was also proud of myself for being honest rather than going along with his version of events. Old habits would have had me supporting his story to avoid conflict, even if it meant misrepresenting what had actually happened between us. An hour later, my phone rang again. "Marcus, what did you say to the property management company?" he demanded without preamble. I told them the truth. The truth is that I was helping you and keeping you company. The truth is that you took over my house and treated me like an inconvenience when I objected. I can't believe you sabotaged my rental application. I didn't sabotage anything. I declined to lie for you. There's a difference. You could have just said you couldn't provide a reference instead of bad-mouthing me. I didn't bad-mouth you. I accurately described our living arrangement and why it ended. Do you have any idea how hard it is to find pet-friendly housing? You might have just cost me the only decent place I could afford. Then you shouldn't have listed me as a reference without asking. I thought you'd want to help me. I do want to help you, but I'm not going to lie to help you deceive potential landlords about your character as a tenant. Marcus was quiet for a moment, probably recalibrating his approach. Look, I'm sorry I didn't ask before listing you as a reference. I should have done that, but couldn't you have just said something neutral? You didn't have to torpedo my chance. Marcus, you presented our living situation as if it had been cooperative and mutually beneficial. You made it sound like you'd been caring for me rather than taking advantage of me. I wasn't going to support that fiction. That's how I saw it. I was keeping you company, helping with things around the house. You were using my house as free housing while treating me like a burden. Those are not the same thing. Fine. I see how it is. You're determined to punish me no matter what I do. I'm determined to be honest about what happened between us. If that feels like punishment to you, maybe you should think about why. Marcus hung up again, and I sat in my quiet kitchen feeling something like peace. For the first time in months, I felt like I was acting with integrity rather than being manipulated into compliance. That afternoon I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called my friend Barbara, whom I'd lost touch with during the months when Marcus was living with me. "Floss," Barbara said when she heard my voice, "I was just thinking about you. How are you doing?" "Better than I have in a while, actually." "Barbara, I owe you an apology. I've been a terrible friend these past few months." "Don't be silly, you've been dealing with a lot since Robert died." "That's part of it, but there's more. My son was living with me and somehow I lost track of everything else in my life, including friendships that matter to me." Barbara and I talked for over an hour, catching up on months of missed conversation. She told me about her grandchildren's school plays and her new book club, and her struggles with her own adult daughter's financial problems. "It's funny," she said at one point. "When our kids were small, we worried about protecting them from the world. Now that they're adults, sometimes we have to protect ourselves from them." "Have you had problems with Diane?" "Not like what you're describing with Marcus. But yes, she has a way of making her financial emergencies into my obligation. I've had to learn to say no without feeling guilty about it." "How did you learn that?" "Practice. Mostly, and realizing that helping her avoid consequences wasn't actually helping her grow up." After we hung up, I realized how isolated I'd become during Marcus's stay. I'd stopped calling friends, stopped making plans, stopped doing things that brought me joy. I'd shrunk my life to accommodate his presence, and he'd filled the space I'd made for him while giving nothing back. But that was changing. With Marcus out of my house, I was reconnecting with the parts of myself that had been dormant. I was remembering what it felt like to move freely through my own space, to make decisions without considering how they'd affect someone else's comfort, to have conversations that weren't centered around managing conflict or avoiding confrontation. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in months. I invited Barbara over for lunch. We sat in my garden eating sandwiches and talking about books and politics and the small pleasures of daily life. It felt luxurious to have a conversation that wasn't about family drama, or boundary setting, or protecting myself from manipulation. "Your house feels different," Barbara said, as we were cleaning up. "More peaceful. It is more peaceful. It's amazing how much space opens up when you're not walking on eggshells in your own home. Are you doing okay though? Living alone? I'm doing better than okay. I'm doing well. It was true, I was sleeping better, eating better, reading more, thinking more clearly. The constant low-level stress of managing Marcus's moods and needs had lifted, and I was rediscovering what it felt like to live without anxiety as a constant companion. But I also knew that Marcus wasn't done trying to reclaim his place in my life and my house. The rental reference incident had shown me that he was willing to use me in ways I hadn't anticipated, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. I was right to be cautious. The next week brought a new challenge that I hadn't seen coming. I was in my garden on Thursday morning, deadheading the roses that were blooming along my back fence, when I heard voices in the front yard. I walked around the side of the house and saw Marcus standing on my porch with a man I didn't recognize. "Mom," Marcus called when he saw me. "This is Dale from the county assessor's office. He needs to talk to you about the property tax situation." I felt a chill run down my spine. Marcus was standing on my porch with an official-looking stranger, presenting himself as still connected to my property in some way. "I wasn't expecting anyone from the assessor's office," I said, walking toward them. Dale, a thin man in his 50s, wearing a polo shirt and khakis, smiled politely. "Mrs. Reed, I'm sorry to bother you. Your son contacted us about some discrepancies in the property tax records for this address." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Well, according to Mr. Reed, there have been some changes to the household composition that might affect the property tax calculation. He mentioned that he'd been living here as a caregiver and wanted to make sure the homestead exemption was being applied correctly." I looked at Marcus, who was studying his shoes with exaggerated innocence. He'd contacted the county about my property taxes, presenting himself as someone with standing to inquire about my financial affairs. "I handle my own property taxes," I said to Dale. "I wasn't aware that there were any discrepancies." "Ms. Reed seemed to think that the caregiver exemption might apply to your situation, which could reduce your tax burden. He said he'd been providing care services and wanted to make sure you were getting all the benefits you're entitled to." Marcus had crafted another fiction, this time presenting himself as my caregiver, rather than acknowledging that he'd been a house guest who'd overstayed his welcome. "I appreciate your concern," I said to Dale, "but I'm not receiving care services, and I haven't applied for any exemptions related to caregiver arrangements." Dale looked confused, but Mr. Reed said, "Mr. Reed is mistaken. He was staying with me temporarily after his divorce, but that arrangement has ended. He's no longer living here and has no involvement in my property tax affairs." Marcus stepped forward. "Mom, I was just trying to help. I thought you might qualify for some tax relief by contacting county officials without my knowledge or permission." Dale was clearly uncomfortable with the family tension he'd walked into. "Perhaps I should come back another time, when you've had a chance to discuss this privately." "That won't be necessary," I said. "There's nothing to discuss. My property taxes are current and correctly calculated." After Dale left, I turned to Marcus. "What exactly did you think you were accomplishing with that?" "I was trying to help you save money on taxes. There are benefits available for seniors that you might not know about. So you contacted the county and presented yourself as my caregiver without asking me first." "I didn't present myself as anything. I just asked some questions about exemption." "Dale seemed to think you were living here as my caregiver." Marcus shrugged. "I might have mentioned that I'd been helping out around the house." "Marcus, you contacted government officials about my private financial affairs and misrepresented your relationship to this property. That's not helping. That's interfering. Everything I did was legal. Anyone can ask questions about tax exemptions, but not everyone can present themselves as having a caregiver relationship with a property owner, when no such relationship exists." Marcus's expression hardened. "I was living here. I was helping you. How is that not a caregiver relationship? Because you were staying here rent-free as a favor to you, not because I needed care, because you took over my space, rather than providing assistance. Because when I asked you to respect my boundaries, you told me I was the problem. So now you're rewriting history to make me the villain." "I'm stating facts. You were a house guest, not a caregiver. Your presence here was for your benefit, not mine. Marcus stepped closer, and for a moment I thought he might try to push past me into the house, but then he seemed to catch himself. You know what? Fine, have it your way, but don't come crying to me when you realize you need help, and there's no one around to provide it. Will you? You're 71 years old, living alone in a big house. What happens when you can't handle the maintenance? What happens when you get sick? What happens when you fall down the stairs and there's no one here to help you? The threat was subtle but clear. Marcus was painting a picture of me as vulnerable and dependent, implying that rejecting his help was dangerous and short-sighted. I'll cross those bridges when I come to them, with help from people who respect my autonomy and don't try to take over my life. Good luck finding those people. After Marcus left, I called Tom Brennan to report the incident with the county assessor. He's escalating, Tom said after I described what had happened. Contacting government officials about your property suggests he's looking for ways to establish some kind of legal connection to your house. What kind of connection? If he could establish that he'd been providing care services, he might try to claim that he has some right to continue living there, or he might try to argue that you're not competent to manage your own affairs. My blood ran cold. Could he do that? It would be difficult, especially since you're clearly competent and managing your affairs well, but it shows that he's thinking strategically about ways to regain access to your property. What should I do? Document everything. Keep records of these contacts, especially instances where he misrepresents his relationship to you or your property. If he escalates further, we might need to consider a restraining order. A restraining order against my own son? It's not about punishing him, Flossie. It's about protecting your right to live peacefully in your own home without interference. That evening, I sat in my quiet house, thinking about how much my life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, I'd been sleeping on a fold-out couch to accommodate a dog. Now I was considering legal action to prevent my son from manipulating government officials about my property. But I wasn't sorry. For the first time in months, I felt like I was living my own life rather than managing someone else's. I was making decisions based on my own needs and values, rather than trying to avoid conflict or keep someone else happy. I was learning that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, it was necessary. And sometimes, the people who claim to love us need to learn that love doesn't give them unlimited access to our resources, our space, or our peace of mind. 3 days after the incident with the county assessor, I discovered Marcus had taken his campaign to a new level. I was checking my mail when I found an envelope from Elder Care Services of Oregon, a state agency I'd never contacted. Inside was a letter informing me that someone had filed a wellness check request for my address, expressing concerns about my ability to care for myself safely. The letter was professional and polite, but the implications were terrifying. Someone had contacted the state and suggested I might be suffering from cognitive decline or living in unsafe conditions. The letter requested permission to schedule a home visit to assess my living situation and determine if I needed assistance. I didn't have to guess who had made the report. My hands shook as I read the letter a second time. Marcus had escalated from manipulating rental references and tax assessors to involving state agencies in questioning my competency. This wasn't just about getting back into my house anymore. This was about undermining my fundamental right to make decisions about my own life. I called Tom Brennan immediately. "This is serious, Flossie," he said after I read him the letter. "Adult Protective Services doesn't investigate frivolous complaints, but they also don't have unlimited resources to verify the credibility of every report they receive. What does this mean for me? It means you need to take this very seriously. If the state determines that you're unable to care for yourself, they can recommend guardianship proceedings. In extreme cases, they can remove you from your home, but I'm perfectly capable of caring for myself. I know that, and you know that, but Marcus is trying to create a paper trail that suggests otherwise. The county assessor visit, now this wellness check request, he's building a case for what? For having you declared incompetent so he can take control of your affair, including your house." I felt sick. My own son was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could steal my home. It was so far beyond anything I'd imagined him capable of that I could barely process it. What do I do about the wellness check? Cooperate full.
Let them visit, show them that your house is clean and safe, demonstrate that you're managing your affairs competently, but also document everything. Take photos of your house, gather financial records that show you're handling your bills appropriately, and ask your doctor for a letter confirming your mental competency. Should I tell them that I think my son filed the report? Not unless they ask direct.
There's a difference. I'm your son. I have a right to be concerned about your welfare. You have a right to be concerned. You don't have a right to weaponize state agencies against me when I make decisions you don't like. Marcus pushed past me into my living room. Before I could stop him, Rex trotted in behind him, immediately making himself at home on my carpet. Marcus, I didn't invite you in. I'd like you to leave. We need to talk, really talk, without lawyers and investigators and all this other nonsense you've dragged into our family. I didn't drag anything into our family. You involved lawyers when you tried to manipulate my property taxes. You involved investigators when you filed a false wellness check report. False? I'm genuinely worried about you, Mom. You're pushing away everyone who cares about you. You're isolating yourself. That's not healthy behavior. I'm setting boundaries with people who refuse to respect me. That's extremely healthy behavior. Marcus sat down in my reading chair without being invited. Rex settling on the floor beside him. They looked perfectly at home, as if this were their house and I were the intruder. Look, Marcus said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when he was trying to manipulate me. I know I made some mistakes when I was staying here before. I get that. But we can work things out. We're family. We worked things out. You agreed to live somewhere else. I agreed under duress. You threatened to kick me out if I didn't comply with your demands. I asked you to respect my space in my own house. When you refused, I asked you to leave. Those weren't reasonable requests. It wasn't reasonable to ask you not to take over my bedroom. It wasn't reasonable to expect me to keep a large dog in a tiny guest room. We were back to the same argument we'd been having for weeks. Marcus still didn't understand why his comfort wasn't more important than my autonomy. He still couldn't grasp that being my son didn't give him the right to reorganize my life around his needs. Marcus, this conversation is going in circles. I've made my position clear. You're welcome to visit, but you're not welcome to live here. What if we tried a trial period? What if I moved back in for just a month to see if we could make it work with better communication? No. What if I paid market rate rent and we had a formal rental agreement? No. What if Rex stayed somewhere else and it was just me? No, Mark, I don't want you living in my house under any circumstances. His reasonable mask slipped, revealing the anger underneath. Why are you being so stubborn about this? I'm not being stubborn. I'm being clear about my boundaries. Your boundaries are unreasonable. My boundaries are mine to set. Marcus stood up abruptly, startling Rex. Fine. You want to be alone. You want to push away the only family you have left. Be my guest. But don't expect me to keep trying to have a relationship with someone who's determined to punish me forever. I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. From what? From someone who loves you. From someone who treats my love like a weapon to be used against me. Marcus called Rex and headed toward the door. This isn't over, Mom. Families don't just give up on each other. Some families don't give up. Other families learn to respect each other's boundaries. After Marcus left, I locked the door and sat in my living room, shaking slightly. He'd been drinking, which made him more unpredictable, and he'd forced his way into my house despite my clear request that he leave. I was starting to feel genuinely unsafe. I called Tom Brennan's emergency number. Flossie? What's wrong? I described Marcus's evening visit, including his apparent intoxication and his insistence on entering my house without permission. That's breaking and entering, Tom said. Or at minimum trespassing. You asked him to leave, and he refused. I don't want to have my son arrested, but you want to be safe in your own home. Flossie, this is escalating beyond family drama. Marcus is showing signs of becoming genuinely dangerous. What are my options? You can file for a restraining order. Given the pattern of behavior you've documented, including the false state reports and tonight's incident, I think we'd have a strong case. A restraining order against my own son. A restraining order against someone who's threatening your safety and autonomy. The fact that he's your son doesn't give him the right to harass you or enter your property without permission. I lay awake most of that night, wrestling with the decision. Part of me still hoped that Marcus would come to his senses and accept the boundaries I'd set, but a larger part of me was tired of living in fear of his next escalation. By morning, I'd made my decision. I called Tom and asked him to begin the process of filing for a restraining order. I want my house and my life back, I told him. If that requires legal action, then that's what we'll do. Tom filed the restraining order petition that afternoon, documenting the pattern of harassment, the false state reports, and Marcus's increasing willingness to ignore my clearly stated boundary. The temporary order was granted immediately, giving me legal protection while we waited for the full hearing. When the deputy served Marcus with the restraining order papers, he called me immediately. "A restraining order," he shouted into the phone. "You got a restraining order against your own son." "I got a restraining order against someone who was harassing me and refusing to respect my clearly stated boundaries. This is insane. You're treating me like a criminal." "I'm treating you like someone who filed false reports with state agencies, manipulated county officials, and forced his way into my house after I asked him to leave. I never forced my way anywhere. You pushed past me into my living room last night, despite my request that you leave. I was trying to have a conversation with my mother. You were trying to intimidate me into letting you move back into my house." Marcus was quiet for a moment, probably realizing that everything he said was creating more evidence for the restraining order here. "This is going to destroy our relationship forever," he said finally. "No, Marcus, your behavior is what destroyed our relationship. The restraining order is just documenting that destruction." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. I spent the week gathering documentation with Tom's help. The letter from Elder Care Services, records of Marcus's contact with the county assessor, photos of my house showing that it was clean and well maintained, the letter from Dr. Chin confirming my competency, and a detailed timeline of Marcus's escalating behavior. Jenny called me the night before the hearing. "Mrs. Reed, I heard about the restraining order. Are you okay?" "I'm as okay as someone can be when they have to take legal action against their own child. I want you to know that I support your decision. I probably should have warned you about Marcus's pattern of escalation when people set boundaries with him. You tried to warn me in your way. I just wasn't ready to hear it. The kids are asking questions about why they can't see. I've been trying to explain without going into details about their father's behavior." "What have you told them?" "That sometimes adults have disagreements that require legal solutions, and that it doesn't mean anyone stops loving anyone else." "That's perfect. I don't want them to think this is their fault or that I don't want to see them. Would you be open to supervised visits? Maybe at my house, when Marcus isn't around?" "I'd love that. Once this legal situation is resolved and things settle down." The hearing was held in a small courtroom with just the judge, Tom, Marcus and his court-appointed attorney and me. Marcus looked nervous and angry, occasionally glaring at me like I was betraying him by protecting myself. Tom presented our case methodically, documenting each incident and showing the pattern of escalation. He presented the wellness check report that found no basis for concerns about my competency, the letter from my doctor confirming my mental and physical health, and photographs of my well-maintained home. Marcus's attorney tried to portray the situation as a family disagreement, being blown out of proportion by legal intervention. He argued that Marcus's actions had been motivated by genuine concern for my welfare, and that a restraining order would unfairly prevent a son from checking on his elderly mother. But when the judge asked Marcus directly about the false wellness check report and his contact with county officials about my property, Marcus's answers were evasive and unconvincing. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, "you contacted Adult Protective Services with concerns about your mother's competence. When they investigated, they found those concerns to be unfounded. Can you explain the discrepancy?" "I was worried about her isolation and her decision-making after my father died, but you filed the report only after she asked you to move out of her house, correct?" "The timing was coincidental. You also contacted the county assessor about property tax exemptions related to caregiving services you claimed to provide. Is that correct? I was trying to help her save money on taxes. Without her knowledge or consent, Marcus hesitated. I thought she'd appreciate the help. The judge reviewed the documentation for several minutes before rendering her decision. The court finds that Mr. Reed has engaged in a pattern of behavior that constitutes harassment of the petitioner. This includes filing false reports with state agencies, attempting to manipulate county officials regarding the petitioner's property, and refusing to respect clearly stated boundaries regarding the petitioner's residence. She granted a 1-year restraining order prohibiting Marcus from contacting me directly, coming within 500 feet of my house, or interfering with my property or financial affairs. Mr. Reed, the judge continued, the court understands that family relationships are complicated, but your mother has the right to live peacefully in her own home, without harassment. If you violate this order, you will face criminal charge. As we left the courthouse, Marcus caught up with me in the parking lot, staying just outside the 500-foot boundary specified in the restraining order. I hope you're happy, he called out. You've legally cut your only child out of your life. I've legally protected myself from someone who refused to respect my boundaries. I called back. Don't expect me to come running when you need help. I won't. Tom drove me home, and we sat in my driveway for a few minutes, discussing what the restraining order meant practically. He can't contact you directly, but he might try to use third parties, Tom warned. If he does, document it and let me know. What about my grandchildren? The order doesn't prevent them from contacting you, but it does prevent Marcus from using them as intermediaries to communicate with you. And if he violates the order, call the police immediately. Violating a restraining order is a criminal offense. That evening, I sat in my quiet house with a cup of tea, processing what I'd accomplished. I'd legally established my right to live without harassment in my own home. I'd documented Marcus's pattern of manipulation and escalation. I'd proven to the state, the courts, and myself that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. But I'd also had to take legal action against my own son, something I'd never imagined I'd need to do. It felt like a failure of motherhood, even though I knew, intellectually, that I'd had no choice. Helen called that night to check on me. How are you holding up? She asked, relieved, mainly, and sad, but also proud of myself for following through. I'm proud of you too. I know that wasn't easy. Helen, do you think I did the right thing? I think you did the only thing you could do. Marcus made his choices, and you made yours. You chose to protect yourself rather than enable his behavior. But he's my son, and you're his mother. That relationship goes both ways. He owes you respect and consideration just as much as you owe him love and support. After we hung up, I realized that Helen had echoed something Tom had said weeks earlier. I'd been so focused on my obligations as a mother that I'd forgotten Marcus had obligations as a son. Over the next few weeks, my life settled into a new rhythm. Without the constant stress of managing Marcus's moods and demands, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant. I started gardening again, joined a book club at the library, and reconnected with old friends. The house felt like mine again. I could rearrange furniture without asking permission, eat dinner at whatever time suited me, and go to bed without worrying about disturbing anyone or being disturbed. Most importantly, I could make decisions about my own life without having to justify them to someone who saw my autonomy as a threat to his comfort. But the peace came with a price. I missed my grandchildren terribly, and I worried about how this situation was affecting them. I also grieved the loss of the relationship I'd hoped to have with Marcus as an adult, even though I knew that relationship had probably never been possible given his inability to see me as anything other than a resource to be managed. 3 weeks after the restraining order was granted, Jenny called to update me on the children and to arrange supervised visits. They miss you, she said, and they're starting to understand that this isn't about them or anything they did. How much do they know? I've told them that sometimes adults have disagreements that require legal solutions, and that you and their father are working through some problems with the help of lawyers and courts. That's probably the right approach, Sarah asked, if you stopped loving their father. I told her that love and boundaries are two different things,
and that sometimes people who love each other still can't live together or spend time together. Jenny's wisdom in handling the children's questions impressed me. She was helping them understand the situation without burdening them with adult complexities or asking them to choose sides. "Would Saturday afternoon work for a visit?" Jenny asked. "You could come to my house, or I could bring them to a neutral location. I'd love to see them. Your house is fine, or we could meet at the park." "Let's do the park. The kids will enjoy being outside, and it'll feel more natural than sitting around my living room trying to make conversation." Saturday afternoon at the park was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Sarah and Jake were excited to see me, full of stories about school and friends and their various activities, but I could also see the confusion in their eyes, the questions they didn't know how to ask about why their grandmother and father couldn't be in the same place anymore. "Grandma," Jake said as we sat on a bench watching Sarah navigate the monkey bars, "are you and Dad ever going to be friends again?" It was the question I'd been dreading and the one I knew I had to answer honestly. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes people who love each other have disagreements that are very hard to solve. Mom says you're working with lawyers to figure things out." "That's right. Sometimes grown-ups need help from other people to work through their problems." "Are you mad at Dad?" I thought carefully about how to answer. I didn't want to burden Jake with adult complexities, but I also didn't want to lie to him. "I'm not angry with your father, but I am disappointed in some of the choices he's made. And sometimes when people make choices that hurt other people, it takes time to figure out how to be around each other again." Jake nodded like this made sense to him, and I was grateful for his acceptance of an explanation that barely scratched the surface of what had really happened. After the visit, Jenny and I talked while the kids played on the swings. "How are you doing, really?" she asked. "Better than I expected. The restraining order has given me space to remember who I am when I'm not managing someone else's emotions." "And Marcus? I don't know. I hope he's getting the help he needs to understand why his behavior was unacceptable, but that's not my responsibility anymore. He's been staying with his friend Dave, but I don't think it's working out well. Dave has rules about pets, and Marcus is struggling with having to follow someone else's boundaries." The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus was learning what it felt like to live in someone else's space with restrictions on his behavior, but apparently he still didn't understand why I'd found his takeover of my house unacceptable. "Jenny, can I ask you something?" "Of course. During your marriage, did Marcus ever acknowledge when his behavior hurt you? Not just apologize for your being upset, but actually take responsibility for specific actions?" Jenny was quiet for a long moment, watching her children play. "No," she said finally. "He would apologize for misunderstandings or for my being sensitive, but he never acknowledged that his behavior itself was wrong. He had a way of making every conflict about my reaction rather than his actions." "That's been my experience too. I think that's why the marriage ended. Ultimately, I got tired of being responsible for managing his impact on other people while he took no responsibility for moderating his behavior." This conversation with Jenny helped me understand something important about Marcus's pattern of relationship. He'd been using the same tactics with me that he'd used with her, dismissing other people's boundaries as oversensitivity, making his comfort more important than their autonomy, and deflecting responsibility for his behavior by focusing on other people's reaction. The difference was that Jenny had eventually divorced him, while I'd continued accepting poor treatment, because I was his mother, and thought that meant I owed him unlimited patience and accommodation. But I'd learned something important over the past few months. Being someone's mother doesn't mean accepting abuse. Love doesn't require tolerating disrespect, and family relationships that only work when one person sacrifices their dignity for the other person's comfort aren't actually loving relationships at all. As I drove home from the park that afternoon, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in months. I'd protected my home, my autonomy, and my right to live without harassment. I'd maintained a relationship with my grandchildren, without compromising my boundaries with their father. And I'd proven to myself that I could handle difficult situations with strength and dignity. The restraining order would be in effect for a year, giving me legal protection while Marcus hopefully learned to respect boundaries. If he used that time to genuinely examine his behavior and develop healthier relationship patterns, there might be a possibility of rebuilding our relationship on more respectful terms. But if he continued to see my boundaries as punishment rather than protection, then the distance between us would remain, and I was finally at peace with that possibility. My house felt like a sanctuary again, not a battleground. My days were my own to structure as I chose. My decisions were mine to make without having to justify them to someone who saw my autonomy as a threat. I'd learned that respect is not negotiable, that boundaries are not suggestions, and that love without respect is not really love at all. Most importantly, I'd learned that protecting myself from poor treatment wasn't selfish or cruel, it was necessary for my own well-being and dignity. Standing in my kitchen that evening, making dinner for one, and enjoying the peaceful quiet of my own space, I realized something profound. I'd spent so much energy trying to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't respect me, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply live without conflict. Now I remembered, and I wasn't going back. 2 months into the restraining order period, I thought the worst was behind me. Marcus had been quiet, the legal boundaries were holding, and I'd settled into a routine that felt sustainable and peaceful. Then I got a call from my bank that changed everything. "Mrs. Reed, this is Janet from First National Security Service. We've flagged some unusual activity on your accounts that we need to discuss with you immediately." My stomach dropped. "What kind of activity?" "There have been several attempts to access your online banking using what appear to be legitimate credentials. The attempts originated from different IP addresses, which suggests someone may have obtained your login information." I felt cold all over. "Has anyone actually accessed my accounts?" "Not successful. Our security protocols prevented the logins, but we're concerned about how someone obtained your credentials in the first place." I drove to the bank immediately, my mind racing through possibilities. Had I been careless with my information? Had I fallen for a phishing scam? Or was this connected to Marcus's escalating attempts to involve himself in my financial affairs? Janet, a professional woman in her 40s, who worked in the bank's fraud prevention department, walked me through the attempted login. They'd occurred over a period of 3 weeks, always late at night, using correct usernames and passwords that were only slightly wrong. "The attempts suggest someone who has partial access to your information," Janet explained. "They knew your username, and had passwords that were close to correct, like they might have seen you enter your information at some point." "How close were the passwords?" "Close enough to suggest familiarity with your password creation pattern. For example, if your password included the name of a pet, or a significant date, they tried variations on those themes." My blood ran cold. Marcus had lived in my house for 8 months. He'd seen me use my computer countless times, had been present when I paid bills online, and knew personal details about my life that I might use in passwords. He'd had access to my mail, my personal papers, and my daily routine.
It felt like preparing for war against someone who was supposed to love me. Tom filed the restraining order violation report with the court, and a hearing was scheduled for the following week. The judge who'd granted the original order would review the evidence and determine whether Marcus had violated the terms. The night before the hearing, Jenny called to warn me about Marcus's state of mind. "Mrs. Reed, I think you should know that Marcus is not doing well. He's been drinking more, sleeping erratically, and becoming increasingly paranoid about what he calls the conspiracy against him." "The conspiracy?" "He believes that you, your attorney, the bank, and various government agencies are working together to destroy his life. He sees every consequence of his behavior as persecution rather than the natural result of his choices." This information was both troubling and validating. It suggested that Marcus was becoming less stable, which could make him more dangerous. It also confirmed that he wasn't taking responsibility for his behavior or learning from the consequences he'd faced. "Jenny, do you think he's capable of violence?" "I don't know. I've never seen him physically aggressive, but I've also never seen him this isolated and desperate. He's lost his housing situation with Dave. He's struggling to find work, and now he's facing potential criminal charges. People can become unpredictable when they feel cornered." "Where is he staying now?" "In his truck, mostly. Sometimes at cheap motels when he can afford it. Rex is making everything more difficult because most places won't allow pets. I felt a pang of sympathy for Marcus's situation, even as I recognized that his current circumstances were largely the result of his own choices. He'd had opportunities to accept boundaries and maintain a relationship with me on respectful terms. Instead, he'd chosen escalation and manipulation. The violation hearing was held in the same courtroom where the original restraining order had been granted. Marcus looked disheveled and angry, his clothes wrinkled and his hair unkempt. He glared at me throughout the proceedings like I was personally responsible for all his problems. Tom presented the evidence methodically: the bank's documentation of attempted account access, the timing correlation with the restraining order period, the police report, and the pattern of Marcus's previous attempts to involve himself in my financial affairs. Marcus's court-appointed attorney argued that there was no direct evidence linking Marcus to the attempted logins, that the timing could be coincidental, and that the prosecution hadn't met the burden of proof required for a violation finding. But when the judge asked Marcus directly whether he'd attempted to access my online banking accounts, his answer was evasive and unconvincing. "Your Honor, I've been concerned about my mother's welfare and financial security. I may have checked to see if her accounts were secure, but that's not the same as trying to steal from her." The judge's expression hardened. "Mr. Reed, the restraining order specifically prohibits you from interfering with your mother's financial affairs. Attempting to access her bank accounts without permission, regardless of your stated motivation, constitutes interference. I was trying to protect her by violating her privacy and attempting to access accounts that don't belong to you." Marcus had no good answer for that question. The judge found him in violation of the restraining order and imposed additional conditions: mandatory counseling for anger management and family relationship issues, community service, and a warning that any future violations would result in immediate jail time. "Mr. Reed," the judge said sternly, "your mother has the right to manage her own financial affairs without interference from you. Your pattern of behavior suggests that you view her autonomy as a threat to your own interests. That perspective is both wrong and dangerous." Marcus left the courthouse that day with additional legal restrictions and requirements, but I could see in his demeanor that he still didn't understand why his behavior was unacceptable. He still saw himself as the victim of unreasonable persecution, rather than the author of his own consequences. Over the next month, things were quiet. Marcus complied with the mandatory counseling requirement, and there were no further attempts to access my accounts or interfere with my affairs. I began to hope that the additional legal consequences had finally convinced him to respect boundaries. I was wrong. The escalation came not through direct action but through a campaign of what I can only describe as character assassination. Marcus began contacting people in my social network, sharing his version of our conflict and portraying me as an unstable, paranoid elderly woman who'd turned against her loving son. I first learned about this when my neighbor Dorothy mentioned it during one of our usual conversations over the back fence. "Flossie, I hope you don't mind me asking, but your son Marcus stopped by yesterday. He seemed very concerned about you." My heart sank. "What did he say?" "He said you'd been having some memory problems and that you'd gotten confused about some family arrangements. He asked me to keep an eye on you and let him know if I noticed anything concerning." "Dorothy, I need you to know that Marcus and I have a restraining order between us. He's not supposed to contact me directly, and he's been legally prohibited from interfering in my affairs due to his harassment." Dorothy's eyes widened. "Oh my. He made it sound like you were struggling with confusion and that he was trying to help you." "That's not accurate. I had him evaluated by the state, and they found no evidence of cognitive decline or inability to care for myself." "Well, he certainly presented things differently. He seemed so concerned and caring." This conversation with Dorothy revealed a new tactic in Marcus's campaign. Since he couldn't contact me directly or access my finances, he was working to undermine my credibility with people in my community. If he could convince my neighbors and acquaintances that I was mentally unstable, he might be able to build support for his efforts to regain control over my life. I called Tom immediately to report this development. "This is still harassment," Tom said. "The restraining order prohibits him from interfering with your life, and spreading false information about your mental state to your neighbors definitely qualifies as interference." "But how do we prove what he's saying to people? We document every instance we become aware of, and we ask people to confirm what he told them. If we can establish a pattern of him spreading false information about your competency, that's another violation. I spent the next few days reaching out to friends and neighbors to find out if Marcus had contacted them. The results were disturbing. He'd spoken to at least 6 people in my immediate neighborhood, telling each of them a slightly different version of the same story, that I was struggling with memory issues, that I'd become paranoid and suspicious, and that I'd unfairly turned against him when he tried to help. Mr. Person from across the street said Marcus had asked her to watch for signs that I was neglecting my property maintenance. Mr. and Mrs. Chen from next door said he'd expressed concern about my driving and suggested they might want to mention their observations to my doctor. Barbara from my book club said Marcus had called her to ask if she'd noticed any changes in my cognitive function during our meetings. Each conversation had been crafted to plant seeds of doubt about my mental competency, while positioning Marcus as a concerned son whose only crime was caring too much. The most insidious part of this campaign was how reasonable Marcus's concerns sounded to people who didn't know the full context of our conflict. To someone who didn't know about his 8 months of taking over my house, his attempts to manipulate government agencies, or his violations of the restraining order, he probably did seem like a devoted son worried about his aging mother. But I wasn't powerless against this tactic. I had documentation of my mental competency from Dr. Chen, records from the state investigation that found no cause for concern, and testimony from the bank that I was managing my finances appropriately. More importantly, I had relationships with these people that predated Marcus's manipulation campaign. They knew me as a competent, organized, articulate woman who maintained her home and managed her affairs responsibly. When I explained the situation to each person Marcus had contacted, providing them with context about the restraining order and his pattern of harassment, their responses were universally supportive. Flossie, Barbara said after I explained what Marcus had told her, I knew something didn't sound right. You're one of the sharpest people in our book club. If you were having cognitive issues, I'd notice it in our discussions. Mr. Chen was more direct in his response. Your son seemed nice enough, but something felt off about the conversation. He was asking very specific questions about your daily routines and habits. It felt more like surveillance than concern. Mrs. Peterson was appalled when she learned the truth. He made it sound like you were neglecting your yard and house maintenance, but your property is one of the best maintained on the street. I should have realized something was wrong. Armed with statements from these neighbors confirming what Marcus had told them, Tom filed another violation report with the court. This time, the evidence was even stronger because we had multiple witnesses who could testify about Marcus's attempts to undermine my reputation. The second violation hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, I took additional steps to protect myself from Marcus's character assassination campaign. I asked Chen to conduct a comprehensive cognitive assessment that would provide current documentation of my mental competency. The assessment included memory tests, problem-solving exercises, and evaluations of my ability to manage complex tasks independently. Flossie, Chen said after completing the assessment, your cognitive function is excellent for someone of any age. You scored in the top percentile for memory, reasoning, and executive function. Anyone questioning your mental competency is either misinformed or deliberately misleading. I also asked Tom to prepare a summary of all the official evaluations I'd undergone, from the state wellness check, to the bank's fraud investigation to the court's competency determination. The document created a comprehensive record of multiple agencies and professionals confirming my ability to live independently and manage my own affairs. But perhaps most importantly, I realized that Marcus's campaign to undermine my credibility was actually backfiring. By reaching out to my neighbors and friends with concerns about my mental state, he was inadvertently strengthening my support network. People who might have remained distant acquaintances were now actively checking on my welfare and offering assistance. Dorothy started stopping by more frequently for neighborly chats. The Chens invited me to join them for their evening walks. Barbara and other book club members began including me in more social activities outside our regular meeting. Marcus's attempt to isolate me by making people question my competency had instead created a community of support around me. The night before the second violation hearing, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, reflecting on how much my life had changed over the past few months. What had started as a simple request for Marcus to respect my space had evolved into a complex legal battle that had forced me to defend my right to autonomy and dignity. But through it all, I'd discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed. I'd learned to set and maintain boundaries even when doing so was painful. I'd learned to seek help when I needed it rather than trying to manage everything alone. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, even when others tried to convince me I was wrong. Most importantly, I'd learned that protecting myself from poor treatment wasn't selfish or cruel, it was necessary for my own well-being and dignity. The second violation hearing was more contentious than the first. Marcus's attorney tried to argue that reaching out to neighbors with concerns about a parent's welfare was normal family behavior, not harassment. But Tom was prepared for this argument. He presented testimony from multiple neighbors confirming that Marcus had asked them to monitor my behavior and report concerns to him. He showed that Marcus had presented false information about my mental state that was contradicted by multiple professional assessments. Your Honor, Tom argued, this isn't a case of a son expressing normal concern about his mother's welfare. This is a deliberate campaign to undermine Mrs. Reed's credibility and reputation in her community, designed to build support for his efforts to regain control over her life. The judge agreed. She found Marcus in violation of the restraining order for the second time, and imposed more severe consequences, 30 days in jail, to be served on weekends so he could maintain employment if he found work, and an extension of the restraining order for an additional year. Miss Reed, the judge said, your pattern of behavior suggests that you view your mother's independence as a threat to your own interests. You've attempted to access her finances, filed false reports with state agencies, and now conducted a campaign to undermine her reputation in her community. This court will not tolerate continued harassment of an elderly citizen who has done nothing but assert her right to live peacefully in her own home. Marcus was led away to begin his weekend jail sentence that Friday. As I watched him leave the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness that our relationship had deteriorated to the point where my son was going to jail for harassing me. Relief that the legal system was finally providing meaningful consequences for his behavior. But I also felt something else. Closure. Marcus had been given multiple opportunities to respect boundaries and maintain a relationship with me on healthy terms. He'd chosen escalation and manipulation instead. Now he was facing the natural consequences of those choices. That evening, I called Jenny to update her on the hearing outcome. How are the kids handling all this? I asked. They're confused and sad, but they're resilient. I've been honest with them about the fact that their father made some poor choices and is facing consequences, but I've also assured them that this doesn't change how much you love them. I do love them, and I hope that someday when this is all resolved, we can have a normal relationship again. I think we can work toward that. The kids need you in their lives, and you need them too. What about Marcus? Do you think jail time will help him understand why his behavior was wrong? Jenny was quiet for a moment. I don't know, Mrs. Reed. I hope so. But Marcus has a pattern of seeing himself as the victim in every situation. He might come out of this experience more resentful than enlightened. What will you do if that happens? I'll continue to protect the children and support them in having a relationship with you that doesn't involve their father's drama. They deserve to know their grandmother, and you deserve to know that. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but a deep sense of rightness about my life and my choices. I'd stood up to someone who was trying to control and manipulate me. I'd used the legal system to protect my rights when family loyalty wasn't enough. I'd built a support network of friends and neighbors who valued my independence and competency. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that I could handle difficult situations with strength and dignity. I was not the helpless, confused elderly woman Marcus had tried to portray to my neighbors. I was a competent,
articulate woman who deserved respect and autonomy. The house that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like a sanctuary again. My bedroom was mine, my routines were my own, and my decisions belonged to me. I'd reclaimed not just my physical space, but my right to live on my own terms. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked around my bedroom with satisfaction. The room where Rex had once dominated my space now held only my things, arranged exactly as I wanted them. The bed where I'd been displaced by a dog was mine again, comfortable and welcoming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but I was ready for them. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd thought, more capable than others had assumed, and more deserving of respect than I'd sometimes believed. The legal battles might continue, and the family drama might persist, but I'd already won the most important victory, the right to live with dignity in my own home. Everything else was just detail. 6 months after Marcus served his weekend jail sentence, my life had settled into a rhythm I'd forgotten was possible. The extended restraining order provided a buffer zone that allowed me to rebuild my confidence and reconnect with the person I'd been before. 8 months of walking on eggshells in my own home. The transformations were both practical and profound. I'd joined a senior hiking group that met twice weekly at different trails around the county. The physical activity helped with the arthritis that had worsened during those stressful months, and the social connections reminded me that I was more than just someone's difficult mother. My house had evolved too. I'd redecorated the guest room that Marcus had occupied, turning it into a craft space where I worked on quilting projects for charity. The living room, no longer dominated by gaming equipment and dog beds, became a welcoming space where friends gathered for book club meetings and afternoon tea. Most importantly, my relationship with Sarah and Jake had strengthened beyond what I'd thought possible. Jenny had been true to her word about facilitating visits that kept the children connected to me while protecting them from their father's drama. We met every other Saturday at different locations around town, creating new memories that belonged just to Grandma. Sarah said during one of our outings to the botanical gardens, "I'm glad you have your own space now. When Dad lived with you, you always seemed worried about something." Her observation was more perceptive than I'd realized a 14-year-old could. Children see things adults try to hide, and Sarah had noticed the constant tension I'd carried during those months of managing Marcus's moods and demands. "You're right, sweetheart. I was worried a lot back then." Marcus had completed his counseling requirements and community service without incident. There had been no further attempts to access my accounts, contact my neighbors, or interfere with my life in any way. Tom Brennan and I met to discuss whether to request an extension of the order or allow it to expire. "What does your gut tell you?" Tom asked. "That Marcus has learned to follow legal requirements, but hasn't necessarily learned to respect personal boundaries. The counseling may have taught him strategies for managing his behavior, but I'm not convinced it's changed his fundamental belief that he's entitled to control other people's lives. We could let it expire and see what happens. If he respects your boundaries voluntarily, that would be genuine progress. If he doesn't, we can always seek a new order." "What's the risk in letting it expire?" "Minimal, given the documentation we have of his previous behavior. If he violates your boundaries again, we'd have strong grounds for a new restraining order, and courts tend to impose harsher penalties for repeat offenses." I decided to let the restraining order expire, not because I trusted Marcus to respect my boundaries, but because I trusted myself to enforce them. I'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics, to document concerning behavior, and to seek help when needed. I'd also learned that I didn't need legal protection to validate my right to live peacefully in my own home. The restraining order officially expired on a Tuesday morning in late October. By Thursday evening, Marcus was standing on my front porch. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He looked better than he had during the court proceedings months earlier. His clothes were clean, his hair was trimmed, and he seemed more composed than desperate. "Hello, Mom." "Hello, Marcus. I wanted to talk to you now that the legal restrictions have ended. What did you want to say?" Marcus shifted his weight, clearly having prepared for this conversation. "I've been in counseling for months.
working on understanding why my behavior was harmful. I know I hurt you and violated your trust. I appreciate you acknowledging. I'd like to try to rebuild our relationship, if you're willing. With better boundaries and more respect for your autonomy. His words sounded appropriate, even thoughtful. But something in his tone suggested he was reciting lessons learned rather than expressing genuine understanding. What would that look like, Marcus? Maybe we could start with occasional visits. Maybe dinner once a month or helping you with projects around the house when you need assistance. And where would you be living during this rebuilding process? I've found a small apartment across town that allows pets. Rex and I have our own space now. This was genuinely good news. Marcus having his own housing situation removed the underlying pressure that had driven much of his previous behavior. I'm glad you've found stable housing. That's an important step. We talked for a few more minutes, with Marcus sharing updates about his job search and his progress in counseling. He was respectful and didn't push for immediate reconciliation or access to my house. When he turned to leave, he paused at the bottom of my porch step. Mom, I know it's going to take time to earn back your trust. I'm willing to do that work. After he left, I sat in my living room processing the conversation. Marcus had said all the right things, demonstrated awareness of his previous mistakes, and presented a reasonable plan for gradual reconnection. But something still felt off. I called Tom to report the contact and get his perspective. How did he seem to you? Different, but not necessarily in a way that feels genuine. More controlled than transformed. That's not uncommon with mandatory counseling. People learn to say what they think others want to hear without necessarily changing their underlying beliefs or behavior patterns. So what do I do? Trust your instincts. You don't owe him immediate forgiveness or access to your life just because he's completed legal requirements. Healthy relationships are rebuilt gradually based on demonstrated behavior over time, not on promises or explanation. Over the next few weeks, Marcus called occasionally to check in, always respectful, and never pushing for more contact than I was comfortable with. He sent a birthday card that was appropriate and kind. He asked Jenny to relay his appreciation for the time I spent with the children. On the surface, his behavior seemed to indicate genuine growth and respect for boundaries, but I found myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when his patience with my caution would run out and his true motivations would become clear. That moment came 6 weeks after our first post-restraining order conversation. I was working in my garden on a Saturday afternoon when Marcus appeared around the side of my house. He wasn't supposed to be in my backyard, and his presence there felt like a test of whether I would enforce boundaries without legal backup. I knocked on the front door, but you didn't answer, he said. I saw you back here and thought I'd say hello. Marcus, this is my private yard. If I don't answer the front door, it means I'm not available for visitors. I just wanted to see if you needed help with anything. The gutters look like they might need cleaning. He was offering assistance while simultaneously violating my boundaries, a combination that felt manipulative despite the helpful intention. If I need help with home maintenance, I'll contact professionals or ask for assistance, but I'm family. It would be and it would also be you finding reasons to spend time on my property without being invited. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, revealing irritation beneath his carefully maintained composure. I'm trying to rebuild our relationship, but you're not giving me any opportunities to show I've changed. I'm giving you the opportunity to respect my boundaries and build trust gradually. Showing up in my backyard uninvited doesn't demonstrate respect. So what am I supposed to do? Never offer help. Never show that I care. You can show that you care by respecting my autonomy and waiting for invitations rather than creating your own opportunities for contact. Marcus left without argument, but I could see the familiar frustration in his posture. He was learning to control his reactions better, but his fundamental belief that he should have access to my life and property hadn't changed. I documented the incident and continued living my life. Marcus didn't contact me again for several weeks, which I took as a positive sign. Either he was learning to respect boundaries, or he was regrouping for another approach. The answer came in the form of a letter delivered by certified mail. Inside was a formal proposal for what Marcus called a family reconciliation agreement. He'd had it prepared by an attorney and presented it as a structured way to rebuild our relationship. The agreement outlined monthly visits, holiday arrangements, and protocols for emergency contact. It looked reasonable on paper, but reading between the lines revealed Marcus's attempt to establish formal rights to access my life and property. I took the letter to Tom for review. "This is interesting," Tom said after reading through the document. "It's not legally binding since you haven't agreed to it, but it shows that Marcus is still thinking in terms of rights and access, rather than relationships and respect. The language feels manipulative to me." I agree. Healthy family relationships don't require legal frameworks to define basic interactions. The fact that he felt the need to have this prepared by an attorney suggests he's still thinking strategically about how to regain control rather than genuinely working on personal growth. I didn't respond to Marcus's letter, which apparently frustrated him more than direct rejection would have. 2 weeks later, he called to ask if I'd received it. "I received it. What did you think?" "I think healthy family relationships develop organically based on mutual respect and trust, not through legal agreements that define access and obligations. I was just trying to provide structure so we both knew what to expect." "Marcus, the fact that you felt you needed to create legal structure for visiting your mother suggests you still don't understand what went wrong between us. Then help me understand. I've been trying to help you understand for months. The restraining order was imposed because you couldn't respect boundaries. The counseling was supposed to help you develop empathy and self-awareness. If you still think our relationship can be fixed with a contract that guarantees you access to my life, then you haven't learned what you needed to learn." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the edge I recognized from our previous conflicts. "So that's it. You're never going to give me a real chance to make things right. I've given you multiple chances to make things right. You've used each one as an opportunity to find new ways to pressure me into accepting what you want, rather than respecting what I need. That's not fair." "Marcus, our entire conflict started because you took over my bedroom for your dog and made me sleep on a couch in my own house. When I objected, you told me I was the problem. Nothing you've done since then has convinced me that you understand why that behavior was wrong. I've apologized for that. You've apologized for my being upset about it. You've never acknowledged that your behavior itself was inappropriate regardless of my reaction." This conversation crystallized something I'd been realizing gradually over the months since the restraining order expired. Marcus had learned to control his behavior when legal consequences were threatened, but he hadn't developed genuine respect for other people's autonomy or rights. He still saw my boundaries as obstacles to overcome rather than preferences to respect. He still believed that his needs and wants should take precedence over my comfort and dignity. He'd simply learned to pursue those goals more strategically. I ended the phone call and made a decision that felt both difficult and liberating. I would continue to support Marcus's relationship with his children through Jenny's mediation, but I would not pursue a direct relationship with him unless and until he demonstrated genuine change, rather than strategic compliance. This decision wasn't about punishment or holding grudges. It was about protecting the peace and autonomy I'd worked so hard to reclaim. I'd learned that I didn't have to sacrifice my well-being to maintain relationships with people who didn't respect me, even if those people were family. As winter settled over my quiet house, I reflected on everything I'd learned during this difficult year. I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd thought, more capable than others had assumed, and more deserving of respect than I'd sometimes believed. My house was truly mine again, arranged exactly as I wanted it. My days belonged to me, structured around activities and people that brought me joy rather than stress. My relationships were based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. Most importantly, I'd learned that love without respect isn't really love at all. Real love honors the other person's autonomy, celebrates their independence, and supports their right to make decisions about their own life. Standing in my bedroom that had once been claimed by someone else's dog, I felt profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought me back to myself. It had been painful, complicated, and sometimes lonely, but it had also been necessary. I was no longer the woman who slept on a fold-out couch to avoid conflict. I was someone who understood the difference between keeping peace and keeping dignity, and I'd chosen dignity. That choice had cost me a relationship with my son, but it had given me back my relationship with myself. The house was quiet as I prepared for bed, but it wasn't the silence of loneliness or defeat, it was the silence of peace, autonomy, and self-respect. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities and challenges, but I was ready for them. I'd learned to protect myself without apologizing for it, to set boundaries without feeling guilty about them, and to prioritize my own well-being without considering it selfish. Rex the dog was sleeping in someone else's house now, and my bedroom belonged to me again. It was exactly where it should be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.